So this lecture about the Qin Dynasty is very short, but well, the lecture isn't so short, but the Qin Dynasty is very short. So you're probably thinking, in 4,000 years, why would this be something we would go over in detail? In some ways, it's going to set some of the standards that we're going to see later on, and some very interesting ideas that we're going to see continue throughout the class. And I would also say that modern Chinese historians consider this period to be extremely important. So this is something that's definitely important to go over. So during this period, we're just going to be talking about one emperor who's generally thought to be the first emperor of China, but China will actually expand significantly beyond the borders that he's established. But the idea is to have this thing that was once a multi-ethnic empire and bring it into one polity, into one political organization. So he started his life as King Cheng, and he actually rose to the throne as a very young man, as a teenager. And when he grew up, he eventually, when he had taken over some of the neighboring dynasties, he called himself Qin Shihuang, or Qin Shihuangdi, which means August, first emperor of Qin. So August means someone who is revered. So revered first emperor of Qin. And the Qin dynasty, which was just one of the many dynasties that controlled areas in what we now know as China, they didn't follow Confucianism. Instead, they followed legalism. And what that means is absolute power and devotion to the king. So we talked about how Confucianism had this balance between tradition and justice, and you don't have that with legalism. Legalism is basically what I say goes. So there wasn't some kind of model that you were supposed to follow that made you a perfect leader. Instead, you can just do whatever you want. And that's the way sometimes people use the word Machiavellian to describe this type of leader. So he was harsh and autocratic. And he squashed and executed Confucius because he didn't want to be limited by the limits that Confucianism would put on someone like this. He felt that the end goal justified the means. And there's some people in Chinese historians who would look back and say, yes, that's the case. And other ones would say, no, that's not the case. So it's definitely one of those leaders who is not seen uniformly. So this is the area that he ended up controlling over time. You can see the Great Wall of China up here. At that time, it was an earthen wall. If you're thinking of the Great Wall of China in your head nowadays, what you're probably thinking of are Ming Dynasty ramparts. So much, much later, more than 1,700 years later than these ones. But like the more modern version of the Great Wall of China, it didn't work. The idea was to stop people from invading from the north, and people invaded from the north anyways. So it wasn't very effective, but he may have wanted to build it because what it did is it got tens of thousands of people working on a project that he was controlling. And autocratic rulers, that's what they want people to do, working for them. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's useful or not. So he squashed and executed Confucius. And this picture is showing the tomb mound of the first emperor of Qin, and there actually hasn't been archaeological digging in there. Instead, we're going to look at this little postage stamp of a corner that is kind of far away from this hill, which was a built tomb. It's not a natural hill, although it looks like one. And this part that we're going to look at was discovered in 1974. So the hill was originally 600 feet high. It's somewhat eroded, and there's also probably other reasons what's going on. It was burned after the emperor's death. Wood roof and wooden fittings were destroyed. The terracottas, which we're going to look at, survive. So according to Sima Qian, who we talked about before, that's writing from the following dynasty from the Han Dynasty, there were 700,000 workers. That's highly unlikely. Certainly tens of thousands. But what Sima Qian might have been doing here by over-exaggerating the number is he wanted to be able to talk about how Qin was wasting resources on something that wouldn't work. And this was one of the ways that the Han Dynasty justified their power. They said the previous Qin Dynasty was wasting resources. So we have a tomb pit with part of the earthenware burial armor of the first emperor of Qin. It's found about a half a mile from the hill by well diggers. And there's now about 8,000 life-size figures that are found in it. So you can see the expansiveness of this space. Remember, these are life-size, a little bit larger in life-size. They tend to be about 6.5 feet tall. I'm sure he picked big guys for his army, but maybe not that big. So you can see what it looks like. Most of these were actually found in pieces. And I'm going to give you a video explaining the paint and what happened to that. But some of them have been reconstructed in place. But a lot of the digging has stopped. And the video will kind of explain this in a little bit more detail. But it has to do with what happened to the paint. So when you peer in there, he had very, very naturalistic works of art going on. So kind of continuing what we had seen earlier, but even more naturalistic. The idea with this particular tomb was for the emperor to replace everything in life in his tomb so that he could be protected forever. So he almost thought of himself as a god, and he needed to have all of this protection in the afterworld. So when you see these horses, they have actual fittings that horses would have. And we're going to take a look at one of these chariots that was actually reconstructed. When you get in close, again, they want to make it look real. These are copies of what in the past they would use human sacrifice. And they would even sacrifice animals, as we had talked about before. But wasn't really a good idea to do that, especially when you're talking about tens of thousands. So he created this army to protect him in the afterlife instead of sacrificing his entire army. So you can see this coach, and they even have the driver on it. And it gives you an idea on what they're working with. So again, very realistic. We could go back into this time period and see it exactly as we see it. An example of a chariot driver. And again, the paint is worn off. So an archer, the Qin armor was famous for its archers. And this is an infantryman. And when you see it, you might think, wait, are they just fighting with their bare hands? They actually fought with spears. So it's not just martial arts that they're using, but the spear is missing in this case. So what's interesting about these, and the video will again go into more detail, but there's individualized faces on each of these figures. So when you look at these faces, they were all made individually, and perhaps they were made as portraits, even sitting portraits perhaps. So the importance of substituting for what was once human sacrifice, you would have to have these individualized faces. The bodies in the video will explain this. They were produced in different ways and weren't necessarily as individualized, but the faces were, and they'll even present some physical evidence to show exactly why that's the case. We know that's for sure. And you see this, so there's a wide range of faces. Another one. And with this, you can get a little bit of an idea of what the paint is like. So the paint was applied, and then there was lacquer over the paint. And lacquer is extremely expensive. In the video, again, we'll talk about more detail about how much labor would go into just acquiring the lacquer, how difficult it was to work with, and what happened. So what happened is that the lacquer dried out over time. So once one of these pieces is dug up, they'll see the paint in all of its glory. And then when it touches the air, it will dry out very quickly. And basically the paint will just flake right off along with the lacquer. So the lacquer was there to be protective, but through time and through the big humidity change that happens when you dig something like this up, it ends up destroying all of the paint. So there's plenty of paint left over, so even if they didn't take photos of it while it was working, they would be able to see exactly what it looked like. But that's part of the reason why they don't want to dig too much in this area anymore, because they don't really have a convenient way to, in the field, stop the paint from coming off. So this is just a reproduction of the way they were arranged in the tombs. They're arranged just like, not necessarily an army that would be in a battle formation, but, you know, in like a parade or something like that. And we can see the colors. The colors of the Qin dynasty are black. Each of the neighboring dynasties had their own colors as well. So their armor and the head of the commanders, they're wearing black. And if you were in class, you'll see a little clip from the movie Hero, which is set during this time period. And in that movie, they have weapons, armor, and all of it is extremely detailed and accurate because it's just copying what was found in the tomb. So that makes it kind of easy when when historical peoples like try to make exact three-dimensional copies of what there was in life. So the assumption is that because this was like just a tiny little area half a mile away from the main burial mound, that entire area is filled with figures, so armies, and then as you get closer, maybe court members, and the imperial court has yet to be found, although we do have some figures that may be part of that, like this one. Contemporary writers describe the main tomb. Simon Qian was one of them. And sometimes when historical people read it, they thought, man, that's a lot. That doesn't, you know, that might be an exaggeration. So they talked about there being a model of the Qin universe inside of the tomb with holes in the sky to represent constellations, and with rivers that represent the 5 main rivers of China, and made out of quicksilver, which is liquid mercury, and mountains. So basically like a microcosm of the Qin universe, more or less, of the lands that became the Qin Empire. So Mercury, you probably know a little bit about that. Mercury is toxic, and if human beings are exposed to it, they get very particular effects. They can cause a type of kind of mental deterioration that will lead to things like delusions and senses of paranoia. So you can kind of understand why they might not want to go into the main tomb. And some Chinese engineers have kind of put probes in the tomb and around the area, and it seems like there's more mercury than there should be in the area. So for now, they're going very slow as far as what they want to do with the with digging up the tomb. But another interesting thing about mercury is that our emperor Qin Shihuangdi, he followed Chinese medicine at that time, and they had a belief that there were elements that each person's health state was associated with, and that there would be certain metals that you could take into your body that would balance out whatever your element was for your health. So his doctors looked at him and he talked about how he wanted to live forever because he literally felt, and he had good reason for thinking this, that everything would fall apart if he died because of all the kind of ruthlessness and charisma that went into making this happen. So he wanted to live as long as possible. As you might imagine, a lot of his enemies, he was taking all over these neighboring dynasties, did not want him to live for a long time. So he had many assassins that would try to kill him, and there were stories about him waking up in the middle of the night and an assassin had killed his guards and had gotten into his bedchamber, and he disarmed the assassin and killed him. Whether or not those stories are true, who knows? But he wasn't assassinated. And he also had people who would test his food because he was always afraid of being poisoned. But unfortunately, as doctors, they prescribed mercury for his particular health element condition. And it was small amounts. Like, they knew that if you took a lot of mercury, you would die. So it was small amounts, but it accumulates over time. And it made someone who had a lot of reason to be paranoid, because there's literally people coming to kill him, all the more paranoid. So some people speculate that maybe that's what's behind the tomb, and that this was almost a crazy type of thing to do. I don't know if there's evidence to support that, but we do know that if he was imbibing this much mercury, that he would have serious mental problems. But he probably had all of this underway before he started to have problems from mercury poisoning. So with this, with a violent beginning and an incredible tomb, I mean, when I talk about this, when I think of the expanse of it, it's one of the most incredible things that I talk about in the class, in any of my classes. It's up there with the Great Pyramids. We go to the continuation, and that's the Han Dynasty. So as you can see, the Han Dynasty is even larger than what we saw with the Qin Dynasty, and it's getting really close to what we think of as China. Obviously, this part of Southeast China isn't in there, and I should say that everything that's here, it still says China. It's not very historically China. It's more of a 20th century thing. But they had expanded further, and how it was founded was Liu Bang, and he was a peasant who was elevated to emperor, and he called himself Hao Gaozu, Gaozu, which means exalted emperor of the Han. And as you can see, the Han Dynasty lasts from 206 BC to about 206 CE. And Li kind of summarizes this very well. Han China, roughly contemporary with the Roman Empire, probably exceeded it in population, extent, wealth, military might, and prestige, and at least equaled it in historical import, becoming the prototype of organization and goals for all succeeding Chinese dynasties. So a lot of the things that we think of as the way that Chinese governments are run are standardized at this time. The Silk Road develops at this time, and it probably had existed in some form beforehand, but what it did is it basically connected China to places farther west. And that's going to become important with the art that we're going to look at in the following periods especially. And then Han characters, if you were there for the day that we watched the clip from Hero, Emperor Qin Shihuangdi, and it talks about how there's so many different characters for writing different ways, and he wanted to standardize things. He wasn't able to do it much in his life, but the Han Dynasty did standardize it. And the Han characters are more or less what you learn today. That's what modern Chinese characters are called. They went back to Confucianism and that synthesis with Taoism as well. So Confucianism more with the government, and then Taoism more with philosophy, and it's going to influence some of the art. And most of what we're going to look at, because this is still a very long time ago, are things for tombs. So we're talking about the Han and the Po. The Po is a part of the soul that is inside of the body in the tomb. So this is kind of gross. And yes, this is the corpse of Lady Di. And you're probably thinking, why are you showing me this? Part of the reason why I'm showing it to you is because her body is incredibly well preserved. Her flesh is soft. You can actually move fluids through her body. They were able to take fluids from her blood and see what was in her bloodstream. They didn't really try to move her, but they probably could if they wanted to. And much of her flesh is still there. So it's a little bit of a debate on why Lady Di looks so good. there's two ideas, or three ideas really. One is that this particular area where the tomb is a very humid area, but it's consistently humid year round. So when the tomb was sealed up, this humidity didn't really change. I mean, it changes very slowly if it's sealed up, but it didn't change in the surrounding areas. And because of that, it was able to be preserved. And that would be for the same reason that sometimes there's accidental desert mummies or accidental mummies found on the top of mountains, because there's very consistent either extreme dryness or, in this case, extreme humidity. So that could be one reason. Another reason could be that Chinese scientists at that time, and we're talking about 2,000 years ago, had taken steps to preserve her body. And there is some intriguing possible evidence for that. When the contents of her bodily fluids were studied, they found some interesting chemicals that could act as preservatives. So it could be they did some things to try to preserve her. And then another idea is that it's just a combination of those things. It's a combination of accidents and things that were done to actually help it. So one of the artifacts that was found on her body that leads to the conclusion that it was probably accidental is this, what's called a flying banner sometimes. It shows Lady Di with her attendants. We'll get in close so you can see what this looks like. And it's a painted silk banner. And if you know anything about textiles, even silk, which is one of the most hardy and long-lasting, it is pretty unlikely that a textile would last for 2,000 plus years. So this is not, this is probably the preservation of her body is probably just as likely the high humidity environment that didn't change much. So O'Reilly and a lot of other people call it a flying banner. And perhaps it was used to elevate her hun, so that's the part of the soul that would leave the body. And her po would be supported by offerings. And again, I'll kind of show you some close-ups of this. It kind of functions similarly to the Book of the Dead for the Egyptians. So it's divided into a couple of ways. It's divided into a yin, which is on the left. You can see it with the moon. And a yang, which is on the right with the sun. So remember, we have kind of like a masculine aspect over here with yang, and a feminine aspect over here. And then the animals are associated with those aspects. And then a mixture in the center, and that's even visualized with these kind of yin and yang going through bees, symbols that are made by the serpents. So then it's organized vertically, where we have heaven, the earth, and then the underworld. So this is kind of a way to look at the earth that we're on, the heavens that we can go to, and then the underworld, which you can also go to. There isn't like a concept of heaven and hell per se. This isn't necessarily a horrible place in the underworld, and this isn't necessarily a great place in the heavens. So the search for immortality was of utmost concern during the Han, and this is the first extant example which illustrated visually and quite literally the root of the soul. So again, it kind of shows what you can do in the afterlife and the types of things that you could expect. So I'll read this poem, and it'll tell you a little bit about what's going on. So at the bottom of the land is another world of water creatures, darkness, and a place below the surface of the earth where souls undergo their first metamorphosis. This is the place that the Taoists call the cosmic womb, where the yin symbol of female creation dwells. So they kind of talk about all of these different aspects, and they were in poetry and in literature from the time, and they're literally illustrated here before we have real writing evidence of it. So then you can see here, get a little bit of an idea with the drawing of how it's organized. And let's get a little bit close and check some of these. So this, we're showing the Earth, and we can see Lady Di right here. Lady Di, and again, her body's so well preserved, we know quite a bit about her. She had some serious back problems and probably some arthritis. And she was slightly overweight for an elite person at that time. Elite person would generally be heavier than other people at this time, but she was pretty heavy even for that. So it may be that she wasn't able to move around a lot. Her teeth were pretty bad, so she was probably, between that and the back pain, was probably in pretty bad pain a lot. And you can see she's a little bit stooped over, which may represent exactly how she was. And then their attendants are behind her right here. So basically what this shows, again, is a model of the Han cosmos. We would have heaven, earth, and the underworld. And again, don't think of this in the same way that like Christians would think of it as in good and bad places, just literally up and down is the way that you can think of it. So when you get in close towards the top, we can see the sun, lots of cranes. There were wooden cranes that were lacquered that were found in her tomb. And then a close-up of the yin and yang. And then we have these intertwining of these sea serpent type creatures. And that makes a yin and yang. So it shows this holistic balance. And then this is a bell. And we'll actually look at ceremonial bells when we get to Japan later on that may be related to these types of bells. So what this is probably picturing quite literally is this poetry, which again functions like the Book of the Dead in Egypt, that says what happens. It warned the soul to avoid the water dragons that swim by side, swiftly darting above and below. So this is literally pictured here, and you could expect to find this in your afterlife. We have the bee right here, and these are still being made at the time. This one's out of jade, like the ones that we looked at that were prehistoric. But the meaning we do know because people wrote at this time. And you can kind of see how it's a preservative and it's used to make another yin yang in the middle of the picture. We have a dwarf kind of holding up the offerings and this dwarf kind of exists in the underworld, holding up the land with the offerings for Lady Di. So coiling cobras, rearing pythons, and beasts with long claws and serrated teeth. Just kind of literally picturing these types of ideas here. So JB is where the yin and yang intertwine. And in the video, they'll kind of talk about, and this is the same video I was talking about before with Qin Shihuangdi. Let's talk about in detail about how jade was thought to be preservative. And it could preserve the soul, but also the body. So this is for the Po, more or less. So lots of offerings. So even at this early date, the primacy of the lines in the narrative and the expression of religious and philosophical ideas. So in other words, we're not necessarily seeing here what we had seen in Emperor Qin Shihuangdi's tomb, where he's just trying to copy the natural world as clearly as possible and precisely as possible. Instead, we're getting an illustration of ideas. So the lines, the way that it's arranged, the composition is all towards expressing these ideas. So this is made for a very, very elite person. People who are a little bit lower on the food chain, this is the son of the emperor, would not have something this fancy. This is not unique. There's a couple of these out here, but it would be an extremely expensive undertaking. I can't even imagine how many people it would take to make something like this today and how expensive it would be. But Other people who are kind of lower down the chain would have jade, or as they'll talk about in the video, again, the same video about Qin Shihuangdi, they'll talk about a synthetic substance they made to actually copy jade because, everybody wanted it and they wanted that protective power, but not everybody was able to get it. So this is made with thousands of these jade chips, basically, that are strung together with gold thread. You want to use gold because it's not going to interact with anything. So they are aware that, there could be chemical interactions with the body. Gold, then it's not a problem. And a gilt bronze headrest. Sometimes people would sleep on these sorts of things, especially if you had a particular hairstyle. But this is the sleep forever. As you can see, it's puffed out a little bit. I'm not sure if that's once they put the body in there, it puffed it out. It may be because he's an elite person, so he was carrying a little bit extra. Oftentimes when I show this, students ask me, what was he in there? Well, it didn't work to preserve his body. Maybe it preserved his Po, but his body was just dusty bones. So Lady Di, who was just covered with a banner, was actually much better off than Lu Xiang. So the idea is to protect his Po. So 2,000 pieces of jade, gold cords. Let's take a close up. It's just so, oh my gosh, look at how tightly everything's fitted together. It still looks good after all these years. You can see how there's all the sealing around it. Just an incredible accomplishment. Again, I can't even imagine the amount of hours and materials that went into this. You get the close-up, and it's almost like the body could move while it was inside here. Probably not very well nowadays, but the idea is to be very close-fitting and protective. And a little bit of space maybe for a gut right there, but it certainly works. And then after talking about this grand empire that was one of the most powerful empires that had ever existed in the world up until that point, I'm showing you this tiny little incense burner. It sits on a table, and that's going to be the second to last thing I'm going to show you. But this expresses, just like Lady Di's banner, a lot of ideas about the cosmology of the ancient Chinese. In other words, the way that they looked at the world, the heavens, the afterlife, our life. So it's a censer that's in the shape of Mount Bo, and it's Taoist. So a lot of these kind of like spiritual ideas are coming from Taoism. It shows an image of paradise, and this is explained in many different ways, and sometimes it's thought to be a real place. So it represents the sacred rivers that descend from the mountains and the Isles of the Immortals in the Eastern Sea, where Taoist philosophers can achieve immortality. So Penglai is this place, and it's believed to exist in the far west or perhaps the Eastern Seas, like some had thought that it was Taiwan at one time. So this is a place where earth and sky are united. And this semester, I won't be able to show this movie in a class, but it's called Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. If you've ever seen that movie, think about the ending of that movie, and you haven't seen it yet, watch it, and then you can see the ending. And you may see some of these ideas existing in the ending of the movie. So the earth and the sky are united, and it's about these yin and yang type of concepts, these opposites. So a mountain, the thing that you think of as being eternal and hard and massive. And then the sky, which is moving. It's something you move your hands through. The clouds, the same thing. They're ephemeral and always changing. And it's bringing these two opposites together. So dragons rise to heaven, rainbows are stored, its rugged mass is forever solid, its great energy is eternally potent, and a span from the ancient to the future. Isn't that beautiful? Rainbows are stored. So on these, they often have animals, a dog and a tortoise and a monkey, and they'll represent things like eternity or moving in time. So kind of these opposites, the same as the mountain and the clouds. So what's kind of neat is there's this idea of the Yunqi, the cloud spirit. And again, If you've seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, I think you'll see this idea in here. And what this sensor does is when you lift up this lid and you can put your incense in it, and it has these tiny little holes, and the smoke comes out of the holes. And what's interesting is you put water in this bottom part, which works because you have this kind of like dragon-like figure below. And what the water does is cools the air a little bit in this area. And when you start to burn it, it tends to make the smoke stick to the mountain and want to stay near it instead of rising up because of the air pressure difference that's happening. So it really gives you this effect. And it does work pretty well. I had a student make one of these for me, not out of bronze, but out of ceramic. And it does work pretty well. So it's representing this Yun Qi. And then the dragon below, which by this time was associated with the emperor and associated with the rain and water. So obviously important things if you're in an agricultural society. So the last thing we're going to look at is, and you may be noticing since we've gotten to the Qin Dynasty, we're looking at a lot of naturalism in general. With the exception of the flying banner, lots of naturalism. So this is a flying horse poised on one leg on a swallow. So literally, it's poised there. As you can see, it's pretty small. It's not super huge, but this piece, this horse, is balanced on this. One of the cool things about bronze as a medium is it's relatively lightweight, and what they, just for instance, the ancient Greeks really liked about it is that if it was going to stand on its own, then you had to compose it in such a way that it was balanced. So the Greeks really valued this visual balance, and you would know that your piece was visually balanced if it was physically balanced, like you would stand it up and it wouldn't fall over. So this is kind of taking that idea, like the ideas we had talked about, solidity versus things that are ephemeral, the mountains versus the clouds. It's taking this idea. So we have this big, thick war horse, powerful war horse, and then a swallow who is small and extremely quick. And literally the figure of this horse is balancing on it. So it's presenting this incredible and impossible idea that couldn't happen in reality, a horse balancing on a swallow. But it's literally making it happen. And there's nothing that's keeping this from standing up. You set it down and it doesn't fall over. So when you see it, it's not only naturalistic, it's also very kind of expressive. So they're trying to get things in motion. And that's something that can be different than arts in the rest of the world at this time. Some of the ancient Greek art has some motion in it. But this one, the motion is definitely part of these yin and yang type ideas that they're trying to express with it. This particular horse, as you can see, a very thick horse, was known as the celestial or blood sweating breed. Such poetic names for these breeds. It was originally bred as a war horse, and then it became a symbol of the emperor. So showing this incredible power and also showing the qualities that a great leader would want to have, you know, powerful and a solid base, but also quick and being able to move easily. So it's kind of amazing.